A banker laughed when a widow's daughter dragged 6 heavy sacks of coins across his polished floor.
You expect me to count all that chicken feed? Pennies, nickels, dimes? This is a bank, girl, not a church collection.
16-year-old Elsie Mercer stood before him in a patched dress, her cold hands resting on the final sack.
You told my mother money was money, Mr. Rusk.
Your mother owes me $417 by noon. Unless there is gold in those rags, I own her ranch before supper.
Elsie pushed 5 sacks forward. Silver and copper spilled across the table. Then Gideon reached for the 6th. It was smaller. Strangely, it did not clink. Gideon opened it.
What is this?
The part you forgot.
His smile vanished, because inside was not money at all. It was something far more dangerous to a banker who had built his fortune on desperate families. Autumn came early to Willow Bend in 1884. The cottonwoods along the creek had already turned yellow, and the north wind carried the smell of cold dirt and wood smoke across the open prairie. The Mercer Ranch sat 2 miles beyond town, a small spread of weathered fence, thin cattle, and a whitewashed house that needed a new roof. Margaret Mercer stood at the kitchen table with a bank notice in her hand. She was 38 and had been a widow for 11 months. Her husband Daniel had died beneath an overturned freight wagon during a winter storm. Since then, Margaret had kept the ranch alive with 2 milk cows, chickens, a vegetable patch, and stubborn determination. Across the table sat 16-year-old Elsie, tall and quiet, with chestnut hair in one braid and gray-green eyes that missed little. Daniel had kept freight accounts before buying the ranch, and he had taught his daughter figures before he taught her to ride. Numbers do not care who is rich, he used to tell her. They only care whether they are true. Elsie read the notice twice. $417 due. Payment required within 60 days. Failure to satisfy the note would result in immediate seizure of the Mercer property. Elsie looked up. Mama, Papa borrowed $240? Margaret folded her hands in her apron. I know. He paid for almost 2 years before he died. I know that too. Elsie pointed at the paper. Then how do we owe $417? Margaret looked toward the stove. Mr. Rusk says there were late penalties after your father died. Collection charges, interest, filing fees. $47 in filing fees? Margaret gave a tired smile. Apparently, paper is expensive when a banker owns the ink. Elsie did not smile back. Gideon Rusk owned the only bank in Willow Bend. He also owned the feed warehouse, held mortgages on half the ranches along the creek, and sat on the town council beside men who owed him money. He was not loud. He did not need to be. He wore dark Eastern suits, carried a silver watch, and spoke to poor people in the patient tone a schoolmaster used with slow children. 3 days earlier, he had come to the Mercer Ranch in a polished black buggy. He had not stepped in the mud. Mrs. Mercer, he had said from the porch, I am not an unreasonable man. 60 days is generous. Margaret had held the notice against her chest. I will pay what we owe. You will pay what the ledger says you owe. What if your ledger is wrong? Gideon had smiled at that. My dear woman, ledgers are rarely wrong. People are. Then he tipped his hat and drove away. Elsie remembered every word. And before we see what Elsie decided to do next, I'm curious. If your family's home was being threatened by a debt that did not seem right, would you trust the banker's numbers, or would you start checking them yourself? Tell me in the comments. Now let's see what Elsie found when she began counting every last coin. The next morning, she rode into town with 2 baskets of eggs strapped behind the saddle. Willow Bend had 1 main street, 1 church, 1 livery, 1 hotel, and enough gossip to fill all of them twice. Elsie sold the eggs to Mrs. Bell at the boarding house for 70 cents. Then she carried 3 jars of preserved peaches to the general store and received another $1.10. She did not spend a single coin. She dropped all of it into a blue enamel coffee tin beneath her bed. For the next 6 weeks, Elsie turned every spare hour into coins. She sold eggs, mended shirts, cleaned the schoolhouse, copied letters, and helped shopkeepers add receipts. A cattle buyer discovered she could check freight bills as quickly as any clerk in town. "You do figures?" he asked. "My father taught me." He paid her $2 silver. The jobs were small, a dime here, a quarter there. But Elsie saved everything. At night, Margaret would sit beside her on the floor while Elsie poured the money onto a blanket. They sorted the coins into rows: copper pennies, nickels, dimes, quarters, half dollars, silver dollars. The sound became familiar, almost comforting. Clink, clink, clink. It was the sound of survival being built one piece at a time. After 4 weeks, they had $112. After 5, 143. They were nowhere near 417. Margaret knew it. Elsie knew it. Neither said so. Then a cattle drive crowded the hotel for 3 days. Margaret and Elsie cooked, washed dishes, and changed linens until their hands ached. Mrs. Bell paid them $28, and a ranch foreman added 5 more after Elsie corrected his payroll. By the end of the 6th week, the blue coffee tin was full. So were a flour jar and an old tobacco box. They counted everything on a Sunday night. $268.83. Margaret stared at the money. "That is more cash than I have ever seen in this house." Elsie looked at the bank notice beside it. "It is still not enough." Margaret reached across and covered her daughter's hand. "No." For the first time, Elsie felt the full weight of the deadline. 9 days remained. The next morning, Elsie rode to the bank. Gideon Rusk sat behind a walnut desk beneath a county map, surrounded by polished brass and cigar smoke. "I want to see our account," Elsie said. "Your mother sent a child to discuss a mortgage?" "She sent the person who can add." Gideon opened the ledger. The Mercer page was crowded with interest, late charges, notice fees, collection fees, and an administrative adjustment. Elsie pointed to it. "What is that?" "A standard charge." "For what?" "Administration. My father paid $176 before he died. Then Mama missed 2 payments while burying him, and you added more than $300. The bank does not price grief, Miss Mercer. No, it charges interest on it." Gideon's face hardened. "You may leave." At the door, Elsie turned. "Will you accept payment in legal coin?" He laughed. "If you find $417 in the chicken coop, I will count every last cent." Elsie remembered those words. She went home and told her mother. Margaret sat still. "Elsie, do not make that man your enemy." "He made himself our enemy when he decided sorrow was a fee." Margaret looked at her daughter for a long moment. Then she sighed. "You sound exactly like your father." That evening, rain began tapping against the roof. Elsie climbed into the attic looking for empty grain sacks. She found 2 behind an old trunk. Then she noticed a narrow wooden box pushed beneath the rafters. Daniel's name was written on the lid. Elsie did not open it at first. Her father's things had remained almost untouched since his death. A coat, 2 work shirts, a pair of worn gloves, his freight ledger. The box felt like crossing a line. Finally, she lifted the lid. Inside were old railroad invoices, bank receipts, canceled notes, and bundles of paper tied with faded string. Elsie sat beneath the sloping roof and began to read. Most meant nothing. Then she found a packet marked Willow Bend Deposits. The papers were 6 years old. Daniel had apparently done occasional bookkeeping work for Gideon Rusk before buying the ranch. There were payment receipts from names Elsie knew: Harlan Pike, Joseph Avery, Martha Cole, Samuel Dent, ranchers who had lost land to Rusk's bank. Each receipt showed money paid. Each had the bank stamp. Elsie frowned. She had seen some of those names in the county foreclosure notices. She carried the packet downstairs. Margaret looked at the papers. "Your father kept these?" "He must have." "Why?" Elsie shook her head. At the bottom of the box, she found a small notebook. Daniel's handwriting filled the pages. The first entries were ordinary calculations. Then the tone changed. Rusk's ledger does not match customer receipts. Pike paid $31. Bank posted $21. Avery paid $18. Bank posted 8. Dent payment missing entirely. 3 pages later, Gideon Rusk says differences are counting errors. They are not. Then, copied receipts before he could destroy them. Elsie felt cold despite the kitchen fire. Margaret whispered. Daniel knew. On the final written page was one sentence. If Rusk ever turns his ledger against us, compare the stamped receipts to the book. Numbers do not care who is rich. For a long time, neither woman spoke. Then Margaret started to cry. Not loudly. She pressed the notebook against her chest and lowered her head. He knew something was wrong, she whispered. And I never knew. Elsie knelt beside her. He left us the truth. The next day, Elsie did not go to the sheriff. Not yet. A copied receipt proved a discrepancy. It did not prove who changed the ledger. She needed something stronger. She visited the families named in Daniel's papers. Harlan Pike had lost his ranch. Joseph Avery had lost pasture. Martha Cole had lost an orchard. Each remembered paying more than Gideon's ledger had credited, and each said the banker had taken their original receipts during foreclosure. By sunset, Elsie understood. The Mercer Ranch was not an isolated debt. It was a pattern. Gideon Rusk had been shaving payments for years, $5 here, $10 there, enough to keep struggling families behind schedule. Then penalties accumulated until the bank could take the land, and the best land along Willow Creek had ended up in Gideon's hands. But there was still a problem. Daniel's copies could be dismissed. The original bank ledger was inside Gideon's vault. Elsie needed a witness who could force it open. She sent a telegram to the Territorial Banking Office in Cheyenne. She spent 60 cents to do it. Possible fraud. Multiple stamped receipts do not match bank records. Foreclosures involved. Request examiner before Mercer note due. Then she waited. 3 days passed. No examiner came. 2 days remained before the deadline. That afternoon, Gideon returned to the ranch with a survey map beneath his arm. He studied the barn, the well, and Willow Creek as if they already belonged to him. Beautiful water, he said. It belongs to us, Margaret replied. For another 48 hours. Elsie pointed to the map. Why survey our creek before the note is due? Business requires preparation. So does theft. Gideon's smile vanished. Be careful about mistaking scraps of paper for power, girl. Elsie went still. He knew. Your father was a decent bookkeeper, Gideon continued, but he copied things that did not belong to him. Margaret went pale. Gideon climbed back into his buggy. Spend tomorrow counting your little coins instead of chasing ghosts. At noon the day after, I take possession. That night, Elsie barely slept. By morning, the territorial examiner still had not arrived. They counted their money again. $302.11. People in town had quietly begun helping. Mrs. Bell bought jam in advance. The blacksmith paid Elsie to organize his books. 2 cowboys brought a tobacco tin of loose change. It was kindness, but it was still not enough to satisfy Gideon's number. Margaret looked at the coins covering the table. Maybe we should leave. Elsie stared at her. Margaret's eyes were tired. We could go east. Your aunt has a room. This is our home. I know. Papa built that barn. I know. You planted those cottonwoods. I know, Elsie. Her voice broke. I also know I cannot watch that man grind you down 1 coin at a time. Elsie looked at the coffee tins, jars, and boxes. Then at Daniel's notebook. Something inside her settled. We are going to pay him. Margaret stared. We do not have enough. We have enough to pay what we actually owe. And he will refuse it. Then he can refuse it in front of everyone. Elsie spent the rest of the day calculating. Original principal, verified payments, reasonable contracted interest, no invented fees. The correct balance came to $294.60. They had more than that. Elsie placed the exact amount into 5 canvas sacks, pennies in one, nickels and dimes in another, quarters, half dollars, silver dollars. She tied each one tightly. Then she took Daniel's copied receipts, his notebook, statements from Pike, Avery, and Cole, and the telegram receipt from Cheyenne. She placed them in a sixth sack. Margaret watched. That one does not sound like money. It is worth more. The next morning was bitterly cold. A pale sun hung above Willow Bend as Margaret drove the wagon into town. Elsie sat beside her with the 6 sacks at her feet. People noticed immediately. The Mercer widow, the daughter, the money. By the time they reached the bank, a small crowd had gathered. Word traveled faster than any horse in Willow Bend. Inside, Gideon Rusk stood behind his counter in a fresh black suit. He checked his silver watch. 11:42. You have 18 minutes. Elsie lifted the first sack onto the counter. It landed with a heavy clatter. Then the second, the third, the fourth. Men from the street began pressing through the doors. Mrs. Bell came in. Harlan Pike, Joseph Avery, the blacksmith, 2 school teachers. Gideon looked at the crowd and smiled. You have made quite a performance of this. Elsie untied the first sack. Coins spilled across the polished walnut. A ripple of laughter moved through the room. Gideon picked up a penny between 2 fingers. You expect me to count all that chicken feed? More laughter. Pennies, nickels, dimes, this is a bank, girl, not a church collection. Margaret's face reddened. Elsie kept her eyes on Gideon. You told my mother money was money. I told your mother she owed $417. We owe $294.60. Gideon laughed louder. According to whom? According to the note. He leaned across the counter. According to my ledger, you are short by more than $100. Then count it. For a moment, Gideon simply stared. He had mocked her by promising to count every cent. Now half the town had heard about it. If he refused, he would look afraid. So he called his clerk. Mr. Pritchard, count the widow's treasure. The clerk began sorting coins. The bank grew quiet except for metal against wood. 10 minutes passed, then 15. No one left. At 12 o'clock exactly, the clerk finished. $294.60. Elsie nodded. The exact balance under the original contract. Gideon pushed the money back. Not accepted. A murmur moved through the crowd. Margaret gripped the edge of the counter. You said if we paid. If you paid the amount due. He tapped his ledger. This is not the amount due. Elsie reached for the 6th sack. Gideon saw it. Well, is that where you hid the rest? Elsie placed it between them. No. Then what is it? The part you forgot. A few people moved closer. Gideon untied the cord. He opened the sack. He saw Daniel Mercer's notebook first. Then the bank stamped receipts. Then the signed statements from families whose ranches he had taken. His face changed. The arrogance vanished so quickly it frightened Margaret more than his smile ever had. Gideon reached inside and pulled out one receipt. Harlan Pike stepped forward. That is mine. Another. Martha Cole raised her hand. That one is mine. Elsie placed Daniel's notebook on the counter. My father copied the payments you changed. Gideon's jaw tightened. Your father stole private bank records. He copied receipts customers already owned. These prove nothing. Then open your ledger. No. The word came too fast. Everyone heard it. Elsie's voice stayed quiet. Why not? Gideon looked toward the door, and for the first time that morning, he seemed to realize how many people were standing there. Then a new voice came from behind the crowd. Because if the girl is right, opening that ledger will end his bank. People turned. A tall man in a brown overcoat stepped through the doorway. He carried a leather case and wore a small territorial seal on his lapel. My name is Nathaniel Ward, Territorial Bank Examiner. Elsie exhaled. Her telegram had arrived, just late enough to make Gideon believe it had not. Ward placed a folded document on the counter. Mr. Rusk, I have authority to inspect your books and freeze transfers of mortgaged property while this complaint is reviewed. Gideon's face hardened. This is outrageous. Ward looked at the coins. No, this is inconvenient. Fraud would be outrageous. The vault ledger was brought out despite Gideon's protests. Ward compared Daniel's copies to the entries. Pike had paid $31. The bank credited $21. Avery had paid $18. The bank credited $8. Cole had paid $25. The bank credited $15. Then Ward reached the Mercer account and recalculated it himself. $294.60. Mrs. Mercer's debt is satisfied. Margaret covered her mouth, laughing and sobbing at once. Ward kept turning pages. Missing payments appeared again and again. Gideon Rusk had not simply overcharged one widow. He had built his land holdings by keeping desperate families permanently behind. The sheriff arrived before the bank closed. Ward had found altered entries, false foreclosure statements, and payments never credited to depositors. Gideon stood behind the same counter where he had laughed. Harlan Pike stepped forward. "You took my ranch over $10, Martha Cole added. "You took my husband's orchard." Ward closed the ledger. "Mr. Rusk, this bank is suspended pending territorial review. Surrender the vault keys." Gideon stared at Elsie. "You think this makes you powerful?" Elsie touched her father's notebook. "No, this just made you honest." The sheriff held out his hand. Gideon gave him the keys. Outside, the cold wind had softened. Margaret and Elsie stepped into the street together. People moved aside for them, not because the Mercers were rich, not because they suddenly owned half the county, because everyone in Willow Bend now knew what those little coins meant. Each penny had been an egg sold before sunrise. Each dime had been a shirt mended by lamplight. Each quarter had been a letter copied, a floor scrubbed, a jar filled, a sum corrected. Gideon had laughed because he saw small money. He had failed to see the work inside it. By spring, the territorial court ordered the fraudulent foreclosures reviewed. Some families recovered land. Others had debts erased. The Mercer Ranch remained beside Willow Creek. Margaret repaired the roof and bought 2 more milk cows. Elsie began keeping books for farmers and merchants across the county. Above her desk, she kept the chipped blue coffee tin and a few coins from that winter. Whenever someone said a small number did not matter, Elsie would shake the tin once. Clink. Then she would smile. Small numbers built this office, and one day they brought down a dishonest bank. Daniel Mercer had been right. Numbers only cared whether they were true. And that is where we will leave Margaret and Elsie, with Willow Creek running clear and the Mercer Ranch still standing beneath the western sky. Tell me in the comments. Did you expect the 6th sack to hold Daniel's records, or did you think Elsie had found the rest of the money? And let me know what country you are listening from today. Maybe you are having coffee or settling in for the evening. If you enjoyed Elsie's story, a like and a subscription help make sure our trails cross again. Thank you for spending this time with me.